Jack. Hey, buddy. So people have asked me to do these walking videos, and I haven't in a while, so it's flannel season, the weather's changed, so now is as good a time as any. A few months ago, I interviewed Bishop Athanasius Schneider. It was a great pleasure of mine. And he had this to say about the consecration of Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary as done by Pope Francis. Take a look.
And therefore, the effect of such a consecration, which is not a sacrament, is not immediate. So otherwise it would be against the Catholic teaching itself. So we would be put on the same level, the sacrament and a non-sacramental action. And then the other aspect also, that people who are awaiting from this consecration of Fatima, which the Pope did, an immediate effect, they have, to my opinion, a deficient understanding of this, because it is a kind of understanding like a magic act. It's not a magic act. You do something and then it is produced. This attitude of these people, they are implicitly, it's a lack of faith. It is a lack of faith. They want immediately see the result.
Right.
But this is not Catholic. This is not Catholic. We have to leave to God the time. It's not in our, as our Lord said to the apostles before he was ascended to heaven, it is not upon you to know the times which the Father established in his wisdom. And the same I would say to these Catholics. It's not upon you to know exactly the time when the effect of the consecration which the Pope did in March will have its effect. It is upon God. Our task was in the Pope to do what Our Lady asked, and then we will leave it to God in his wisdom. And also, maybe the effect it's not necessary that the effect would come immediately at once in a moment. The effects can also come gradually, step by step. Maybe God will operate in this way. We leave it to God.
So Bishop Schneider says that those who hold to the common opinions about Pope Francis's, I should say common traditional Catholic opinions about Pope Francis's consecration of Russia, demonstrate a lack of faith. Now, I'm not here to impute on anybody motives or understandings or anything like that. That's not what I'm doing. But the bishop said it. So what did he mean by that? Well, first things we have to do is like this video, subscribe to this channel. You know the deal. But in all seriousness, we have to ask ourselves a couple questions. Number one, we have to ask ourselves, why would Bishop Schneider say that it demonstrates a lack of faith for people to be saying things like, I haven't seen the fruits that I would expect to see. Pope Francis didn't do it exactly the way that Our Lady suggested. Those are pretty much the things that you hear. Why would he say that this understanding about it demonstrates a lack of faith? Well, this is how I see it. The reality is that there is a lot of mystery in what was requested by Our Lady of Fatima. Now, people might say to that, no, it's very specific. Look, it's all in all these writings from Sister Lucy and so on and so forth. No. There are very few things that are from the whole Fatima narrative that are perfectly official. There are various statements from Sister Lucy that can be taken in various different ways. For example, in her first letter to, I think it was her first letter to Pope Pius XII, she said that Our Lady had requested the conversion of the world and Russia, and she actually wrote that in the letter. Pope Pius XII went through with a written consecration of the world to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. I can't remember if he asked the bishops to join in, but anyway, it wasn't a consecration of Russia. Then a few years later, in an interview with Walsh, the author of the famous book about Fatima from, I think, 1946, she said there, in an interview question with him, that the consecration of Russia, or the world, was not sufficient. Our Lady said, Russia, Russia, only Russia, I think is the exact statement. Well, here's the thing. Sister Lucy says different things about it. This is not to impute anything on Sister Lucy. This is just a reality of the narrative. So taking this into account, we have to go even deeper and say, well, what is a consecration in the first place? Well, the basic definition of what a consecration is setting something apart for something holy. So if you actually look it up in the dictionary, just the regular dictionary, you'll find things like making something into something sacred, or declaring that something is for sacred usage. So we might think, for example, a bishop consecrates a church. We might think, for example, of doing a personal consecration to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. And the reality is that all of these things are actually just an act of faith. There isn't a perfectly particular way to do it. There are sacraments that are consecrations, like baptism, the Eucharist, and so forth. But the sacramental part is different than the basic consecratory part. Yes, the transubstantiation of the Holy Eucharist is an act of consecration, but the actual formula itself for the actual sacrament is very specific. This is not how consecrations of persons or places work. To be honest, if the bishops of your country found that your country was in a certain state of disrepair and said, you know what would really help? Is if all the people in this country, all the Catholics, together united in prayer as best as they could, and said, we're going to consecrate this nation to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. All that would be necessary is just, well, basically to get everybody to do that. There would be no perfect formula that would have to be recited for it to be valid. It wouldn't even really be necessary that every single person did it, because this is an impossibility. People could be sick, they could be non-believers, whatever. It would just be, the intention is behind the Catholic populace, as far as it can be seen, that they want to do something as an act of faith for their country. That would suffice. So Our Lady asked that Russia be consecrated in union with the bishops of the world to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. She didn't say that it would be impossible to add other nations to the consecratory prayers. And in fact, there's nothing wrong with this, if there are, and then I'll explain why. You know, I have 5 children, and sometimes I ask my kids, hey kids, can you clean your room? Now, I like to pretend that they're always obedient, and they're not. But if I were to ask them to clean their room, and I would go up to their room and I would find out that they hadn't done it, but they had cleaned the bathroom, I would say, well, thanks for cleaning the bathroom, but you didn't do what I asked. There might be some merit in what they did, but really they didn't do what I asked. Now, if I found out that they cleaned their room and they also cleaned the bathroom, and I said, well, why did you also clean the bathroom? And they said, well, to be honest, we just really respect you, Dad. This is a parallel universe where my kids act like perfect little angels. We really respect you, Dad, and we want to do more than you asked, or, we realized the bathroom also needed cleaning, and we thought we'd just do it. To be honest, I would say, wow, I'm very pleased with you. I mean, I asked the minimum and you did the maximum. Thank you for that. That wouldn't be an act of disobedience. That would be an act of obedience and something else with it. There's no reason why we can't see what Pope Francis did as what I just said. Pope Francis said, in modo particolare, in a particular way, I consecrate Russia and Ukraine. The argument could also be that at the time of the request for the consecration, much of Russia, or much of Ukraine, was under the rule of Russians at various times in that history. Also, many Ukrainians consider themselves Russians. I mean, that's a whole other story that's way above my pay grade to explain the whole thing. But it's not out of the realm of reason to consider something like that. Okay, so personally, I believe we can say Pope Francis did the consecration of Russia. But here will be or did it validly. Here will be the retort. 2 things. 3 things. Number 1, they'll say, well, it's not clear that he did it in union with all the bishops. Actually, that's not true. The Pope is the Pope. He's the head of the Catholic Church. Our Lady did not say do it in unison with all the bishops. She did not say that every single bishop had to participate. She said in union. If the Pope does something publicly and says he's doing it in union with the bishops, it's actually just the fact that he's just doing that. If I'm a father of a family and I say, I am acting on behalf of my family in union with all my family members, there could be reasons why they're not there. There could be reasons why some of them are obstinate and stubborn and won't listen to me. There could be a million reasons. But the fact is that I have the authority to say that, and in a similar way, or in a more authoritative way even, the Pope has the authority to say that I'm doing something in union with the bishops, and I'm doing it as an act of faith on behalf of the whole church in union with the bishops. There's nothing wrong with that at all. And we also know that many bishops, perhaps even a moral majority, did participate. Now, the second thing people will say was, they'll say, well, what about all the fruits? Where are the fruits? And we're going to talk about why that's actually a dangerous way to look at it and unbiblical in a second. And the third thing they'll say is, well, wouldn't it be shouldn't we just do it again? Shouldn't we just do it in a way that, there's no monkey business? The Pope will only say Russia, and, he'll do something like, he'll make sure that, all the bishops have to do it, and if they don't, they all get, excommunicated the moment that it starts. Technically, they don't count as bishops and things like that. Basically, let's just do it in a really particular way, and let's just make sure that we made no mistakes, and we'll do it again. Those would be kind of the main three objections I usually get. The first one I've answered, this idea that in union with the bishops. We're going to tackle the third one first. And that's the idea that, well, shouldn't we just do it again? Shouldn't we do it in a way where it's clear and obvious for everyone's stipulations that it's exactly what Our Lady asked for, there's no mention of any other country, and so on and so forth? Well, it would be impossible to fulfill everybody's desires for that, let's be honest. But let's just say that was an argument. Well, we need to look at Moses. We need to look at Moses in the book of Exodus, and I believe in the book of Numbers. And you know the story. The Israelites were basically dying of thirst, and God tells Moses, in the first case, to go and strike the rock. And what happens? Water flows from the rock, and the Israelites don't die of thirst. Then later on, as continually happens in this journey of Moses, while they're wandering about the desert, now at this point, they're dying of thirst again. And God instructs Moses to speak to the rock, not strike the rock, but out of frustration, wanting to just have the water, wanting to just do it again, he strikes the rock. Now, I believe they still actually get water out of God's mercy. He still provides water for them. But then what happens? They're punished, and Moses never enters the promised land. You see, he had already done it one way. That was done. But in his hastiness, he wanted to do the same thing again and get the same result. Or a different result, maybe. Maybe a better result. And in fact, he was severely punished for it. If we keep asking for the consecration of Russia to be done again and again and again in the way that we think it should be done, and again, I don't believe John Paul II did it properly because he didn't say Russia, and I don't believe that Pope Pius XII did it properly because it wasn't clearly in union with the bishops. But I think we can make the argument that Pope Francis did, as I've said many times. If we want the Pope to continually keep consecrating Russia because we are grumbling like the Israelites in the desert, because we think God has abandoned us, because we think it hasn't happened in the way that we believe that it should, well, the scriptures would tell us that, to be honest, we kind of deserve to be punished. And the second objection that I mentioned was this idea that, and I get emails like this all the time. One I got the other day. Mr. Hall, you must admit, there have been no fruits. There's no fruits. Pope Francis's consecration was insufficient. Well, let's just take a look at one of the most important figures in the history of the faith. Let's take a look at Abraham. So we all know the story. I believe Scripture says Abraham was a man after God's own heart. Abraham was a man consecrated to God. He was declared a holy man. You know the story. He was Abram, then he becomes Abraham. He literally had his name changed as part of the fact that he was consecrated to God's service. He was declared holy. He was made and set aside for a very particular sanctified thing. Now, you also know that Abraham was given many assurances, promises from God. That, you've heard this, I think it happens at least half a dozen times. Your descendants will be numerous. Analogies like your descendants will be as numerous as the grains of sand on the beach. Your descendants will be as numerous as the stars, and so on and so forth. But there's one particular moment that demonstrates the type of faith that Abraham, as a man who was consecrated, had to have in his service to God. And this happens in, I believe, Genesis chapter 15. If I'm not mistaken, I think it's verse 5. And this is one of those moments where Abraham is being asked to be faithful to God. And the analogy or the image that is used in his conversation with the Lord is that go count the stars. Your descendants, and I'm paraphrasing, your descendants will be as numerous as the stars. Go count the stars. Pretty normal, pretty mundane. We've heard these promises from God before to Abraham. But something different happens in this chapter. He doesn't just say your descendants will be as numerous as the stars. We actually find out a couple verses later that the sun is still up. And how do we know that? Because it says a couple verses after that, the sun started to set, or the sun set. So what does this mean? It means in his discourse with God, Abraham was told to go and count the stars while the sun was still shining. And that represented his seed to come. Why is that important? Because in the day, you can't see the stars. They're not out. But you know they're there. So this is a promise, and this is God asking Abraham to look at something with a double meaning. Not only is he being asked to look at the heavens, which I'm looking at right now. It's kind of a clear night. You can see some stars. Just that is an act of faith. Look up there. Those represent the offspring you'll have. Well, I can see them, but of course it's still abstract because those aren't actually my family. Those aren't actually my descendants. So it's still an act of faith. But hold on a second. If it's the middle of the day, I look up. I can't see any stars. But I know there are billions of them. So here is another layer of faith that I'm being asked, or that Abraham's being asked to demonstrate in his covenant with God. You can't even see the stars, but you know the stars are there. And you must trust that those things that you cannot see represent a solid truth about the descendants that you'll have. When did Abraham see the fruits of God's promise to him? Pope Francis's consecration happened in March. It's been about, end of March, let's say April, May, June, July, August, September. It's been about 6 months. Did Abraham see his promise come true in 6 months? What happened when Moses was in the desert and the Israelites were grumbling in a matter of months and years that God's promise of bringing them into the Holy Land had not come true? He smacked the rock. He tried to do it again. He was punished, and Moses never entered the Holy Land. How are we any different? We look at the greatest patriarch, arguably the greatest patriarch in the Old Testament, Abraham. Or flip a coin. Abraham, Moses, doesn't really matter. But the point is he's one of the greats. He's told by God that his descendants will be as numerous as the stars, and he's told to count those descendants when he can't even see them. And he trusts. And thousands of years later, it comes true. But here we are, grumbling on the internet, posting with certainty in comment sections, and sending emails. There's no proof that Pope Francis's consecration, there has been no fruits. Why on earth do we think we deserve to see the fruits of a promise from God faster than Abraham and Moses? Give me a break. St. Paul tells us that we have to walk by faith and not by sight. And Abraham demonstrates this to us. He literally has to count the things that he cannot see but knows are there. Yet we think that the consecration, or many of us think, and this is both Novus Ordo and traditional, because in the Novus Ordo world, they point to John Paul II's consecration and the fall of the Soviet Union and say, this is definitive proof. No, it's not definitive proof. Russia has not converted. Russia is still, medium on its Christian sentiment, and obviously the Russian Orthodox Church doesn't believe that Catholic baptisms are even valid, so that's not a conversion, I'm sorry. And the traditionalists say, rightly so, that Pope John Paul II's consecration was not the one because that moment of the Soviet Union falling doesn't count as the fruits. And now they're saying, and I'm generalizing here, that there's no possible way that Pope Francis is right because we haven't seen the fruits. That's not how it works. That's not how acts of faith work. If you consecrate your family to the Sacred Heart, do you say that consecration didn't work because when your son is 16 years old, he falls off the rails and stops practicing his faith for a while? Or do you fall back on that consecration and you trust that having consecrated your family to the Sacred Heart means that your son ultimately will not be lost? That is faith. Expecting to see things to prove that what you believe is true is not faith. That's magic. That's science. But it's not faith. It is not supernatural faith. Expecting to be able to smack the rock over and over again to get the result that you want because you believe it should be done like this, even though God has not instructed you in those specifics. That's not faith. It's testing God. Our Lady said that in the end her Immaculate Heart would triumph. That we have to believe. Our Lady said that if a consecration in union with the bishops of Russia to the Immaculate Heart of Mary was done, which it has been, in all the ways that we can see it being done, that Russia would convert. She did not say when. For all we know, it could be 2,000 years from now. It could be 2 weeks from now. For all we know, Roe versus Wade was a fruit of the consecration. That's great. But it doesn't have to be. I think it was. I mean, there's a lot of evidence for that. But even if it's not, it doesn't really matter. For all we know, this act of Pope Francis was done, and there's some young man right now in Russia who was just born, some infant, baptized, and now is set apart by some special holy mission where he will be the great patriarch of the Church of Russia, and in 75 years, there will be some sort of concordat between Russia and Rome, and they come back together. And it is here that we see the conversion of Russia. I have no idea, and neither does anybody else. All I do know is that if we act like Moses and we keep smacking the rock, God will punish us. And if we look at what it actually means to live by faith, then we have to be willing to be like Abraham and believe that even the things that we cannot see are there, and be ready to wait thousands of years if that's what it takes. I hope that makes sense. Like this video, subscribe to this channel, and say hi to Jack. Jack! Hey, buddy. Hey, Jack. This has been the Kennedy Report. Until next time, God bless.